Okay, I believe it's 9:10. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Are we ready, Linda?
Yes, we're ready.
Great, thank you very much. I am calling the Board of Investment meeting to order. Today being Wednesday, October 12th, it is 9:11, 9:12. Before we proceed, Linda, would you please make announcements and take a roll call, please?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Sanchez. I said Mr. Sanchez, Mr. Sanchez. This meeting is being conducted as a virtual meeting, so I will do a roll call of the trustees to confirm attendance. Mr. Knox?
I am here, and Elizabeth Buenrostro Ginsburg will be taking over for me as the voting member, probably between 11 and 11:30, but I will give you a heads up, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Green? Mr. Kehoe?
Present. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, thank you. Ms. Sanchez?
Present, and I will be dropping off at the bottom of the hour.
Okay. Mr. Kelly's absent today. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones? Ms. Jones will not be joining us today. Ms. Greenwood?
I am here. Thank you. Good
Thank
morning.
you. And Mr. Santos?
Present.
Thank you. Staff participating in the meeting include CIO John Grable, DCEO Louis Lugo, Interim CFO Ted Granger, Chief Counsel Stephen Wright. Investment staff include Esme Del Bosque, Ron Kandwa, Magdalia Armstrong, and Jeff Gia. We have several consultants today, Makita Investments Group, Stepstone Group, Alborn. We also have our actuaries on site, Milliman. It's going to be Nick Collier and Craig Glide. And lastly, we have our Ashley Dunning from the Nossaman Group. Trustees, please use the Zoom chat option to be placed in the queue. At this time, we ask all meeting participants to mute their mic until you're ready to speak. And now we may proceed with the agenda.
Linda, I am concerned that we're going to lose the quorum because I know Ms. Sanchez is done at the end of the hour, and Mr. Green said that he's also dropping off at some point. Does that leave us without quorum? Because
So
if we are going to request that we move to action items so that way we can vote on the action items.
Okay, so we have a quorum right now, but go ahead, Mr.
I just want to mention I'm here until noon, so at noon I do have a hard stop myself.
Okay, so yes, we have to proceed with the action items.
All right, so if there's no objection from my colleagues, I'm going to obviously rearrange the agenda and go directly to item 6, non-consent. Well, we should go ahead and vote on the consent items.
I'm here, by the way. Sorry about that.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I will entertain a motion for item A and B of consent items 5.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and second. Any questions, concerns? Seeing none. Roll call, please.
Okay, Mr. Knox?
Aye.
I don't see Mr. Green yet. Mr. Kehoe?
Aye.
Ms. Sanchez?
Aye.
Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Ms. Greenwood?
Aye.
And Mr. Santos?
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
Great, thank you very much. So the next item, what we're going to do, that will be an action item. And what I'd like to do is have the discussions. I guess this is for Ms. Del Bosque. Let's have the discussion that we need to have in open session. Then we go right after immediately in closed session, so that way we can dispose of this item while we have a quorum.
Mr. Santos, did you want to also approve the minutes?
Oh, yes, please.
I will move the approval of the minutes.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Okay. So the minutes, Mr. Knox?
Aye.
Mr. Kehoe?
Aye.
Ms. Sanchez?
Aye.
Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Ms. Greenwood?
Aye.
And Chair Santos?
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
Great, thank you
Will that
very
apply
much.
to both?
Yes, for both.
Thank you.
Point of
All
order,
right.
Chair Santos.
Yes,
We do need to offer public comment.
that's right. Thank you for keeping us honest. Public comment, Linda, do we have any requests for public comment?
We do not.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Rice. Appreciate that. Keeping us honest here. Okay, so now we're ready for the non-consent item, Ms. Del Bosque, and then let us know when we're ready to go into executive session to address this item.
Should we have
The
the
floor-
open session item first? And Noah,
Yes.
if you'd be so kind as to pull up the slides.
Okay, you have the floor.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Noah. Good morning, Chair Santos and members of the board. Today, the Global Equity team will be presenting 2 items regarding its emerging manager separate account manager search. This first open session item is regarding the sizing of the emerging manager program and is directly linked to the recommendation which will follow. The presentation in closed session does contain information that's confidential, and therefore that discussion is in closed session. I'll pass it off to Jeff to further provide detail on the allocation recommendation. Jeff?
Right. Thank you, Esme. Good morning, Chair and trustees. As Esme mentioned, today we're seeking the board's approval to increase the Global Equity Emerging Manager Program range from 0 to 5% to 0 to 10%. For the duration of the presentation, we'll refer to the Emerging Manager Program as EMP or the program. I'll direct you on the table on this slide, which shows the subcategory breakdown of the global equity portfolio. If you look at the bottom row of the table, you'll see that the EMP is housed within the active subcategory, and its current allocation is approximately 81 million, or about 0.4% of global equity. As a reminder, at the end of last year, the EMP's allocation was about 0.9%. After the board graduated Global Alpha from the program in January, 1 manager remains and the weight was reduced to the current 0.4%. So the rationale for our recommendation to increase the program range is in conjunction with today's closed session material, where we have identified 2 finalists from the search for the board's consideration. By increasing the range to 0 to 10%, it will accomplish 3 things that can set the path for a successful program. First, it will allow for a larger allocation to strategies that provide differentiated sources of alpha, potentially improved return and manager graduation. Second, it will move the active subcategory closer to the 25% target. And lastly, it will provide the flexibility to allocate more capital to the program in the future. Next slide, please, Noah. The other direction. Thank you. The last slide shows that increasing the program range will be consistent with LACERA's strategic initiatives. As shown in the green dotted box, it will enhance operational effectiveness by allowing the program to ramp up faster. Additionally, it will optimize investment models through expansion of the customized programs, which increases the opportunities for graduation. Makita has reviewed our recommendation and their support memo is attached. So with that, this completes my prepared remarks, and we're happy to answer any questions.
I don't see any questions pending. I think
have
at
a
this, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Kehoe. You got the floor.
Thank you. So when we're talking 5%, are we talking about 5% of global equities or total portfolio? Where is the 5% of what?
Yeah, that's just referring to the total of global equity.
Got it. So we're 5% global equities. You're asking for 10%. We're currently at 0.4%, correct?
Correct. We're actually asking for the range. So currently the range is 0 to 5%. We're expanding that to 0 to 10%.
Yeah, I understand that. And our current actual investment is 0.4%, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And where have we been at the height of this? Where have we ever broke 1%, or are we at 0.9% was the height?
I believe back in 2017, when we funded the emergency manager search back then, I think we have reached. I don't have the specific number. I believe we exceeded 1% with 3 managers. Or thank you,
Yeah,
Ron.
roughly.
We have 3% at the
3%.
time.
Yeah.
Okay. So just for my colleagues, I'm going to be a no vote just because we haven't actually come anywhere clear past 5%. We're talking about going up to 10%. I think we need to see some successes. I think we need to see some growth in it. Then we come back. I think we're being a little premature, but I understand if those disagree. I think it's an important program. I'm in very much support of the program, but I don't want to ramp up too quickly without looking at this step by step. I think going from a 1% ceiling to a 10% potential, I understand it's a range, but I think that the board needs to control that range more actively as we manage this. So I'm going to be a no vote.
Mr. Grable?
Just one thing for the board to consider is when our allocation may have peaked at that lower number that Jeff mentioned, the total allocation to public equity was higher. Currently, it's 32%, I believe. So this is up to 10% of 32% of the fund, just as another data point.
Thank you for that, Mr. Grable. Also, Mr. Grable, if I remember correctly, we had 2 managers in this space. We were dissatisfied with those 2 managers, and then we issued an RFP. We had a difficult time finding the right managers, if I remember correctly, and then finally, this is the culmination of the efforts that we are making since we terminated the fund of funds to managers years ago. Is that correct, or am I mistaken?
Yes, and there's an intermediate step. We had several fund of funds in 2017. Then the program was insourced, and it was difficult. We expanded the parameters, and the search wasn't that successful, so it led to this reimagination of the program.
I agree. That's just for background basis. All right, so let's go into executive session so that way we can discuss the balance of the presentation.
We need to, this is a non-consent item, so we're going to need a motion.
Yes, so point of order.
Well,
Point of order, Chair Keough. The vote on the policy change, including the motion, the second, will ultimately need to be made in open session. If you do want to break at this point in this item and go to the closed session item and act on the managers, that's fine, but you'll have to return to this item in open session for the motion and the vote.
Okay, got it. So I will entertain a motion with regards to this particular item.
I'll move it, Mr. Chair.
It's been moved. I will
I'll
second.
second it.
Okay.
It's been moved and second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, roll call, please.
Mr. Knox?
Aye.
Mr. Green?
Aye.
Mr. Kehoe?
No.
Okay. Ms. Sanchez?
Yes.
Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Ms. Greenwood?
Aye.
Chair Santos?
Yes.
Okay, the motion passes with 1 no.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. Now we can go into executive session to discuss the managers while we have a quorum.
Yeah,
So,
so
Linda, could
we
you-
need some time, like about 4 minutes, so we can move people around. Sorry about
Okay,
that.
so let's take 4-minute break.
Just 1 minute.
Thank you so much, Mr. Santos. I appreciate moving the action items along.
Okay,
I have to drop
so
off.
we can start the meeting now.
Hey, thank you, Linda. Sorry, that was a quick, quick 1 minute break. Okay, so we're back on regular order of business. Let's go to our reports. Section 7, subsection 8. Fiduciary duty.
Yes, Chair Santos, let's briefly introduce Ashley Dunning, Fiduciary Counsel, who is going to provide some information regarding the exercise of fiduciary duty in actuarial decision-making, which is relevant to the experience review that's going to be taking place this year, and you'll be hearing about a little bit later on the agenda, and also the upcoming valuation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ashley.
Good morning, members of the board, and thank you, Mr. Rice, for the introduction. Happy to see you all. I am to share my screen, so I will do that right now in the hopes that you can all see it. Can you all see, Mr. Chair, can you see the screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So as your general counsel noted, this is intended to sort of set the stage for your discussion of actuarial assumptions and to discuss the fiduciary principles that are to guide you as trustees of the Board of Investments. You'll be very familiar with the overview sort of framework, but I'll get quickly into details applicable to actuarial assumption setting. Just as a reminder, when we talk about fiduciary duty, we first start, or I typically first start with your fiduciary duty of care. That's the first prong of fiduciary duty, and then turn to the duty of loyalty, which is the second prong of fiduciary duties. In this presentation, I'll then move to applying those fiduciary principles to the actuarial assumption setting process. As I go through the presentation, if you have questions or comments, please raise your hand or do whatever is your preference to try to sort of get my attention. If I don't see you, I ask that the chair or Mr. Rice call on you for me. All right, fiduciary duty of care. The duty that is imposed on you by constitutional law in California is that you are considered a prudent fiduciary with experience. You have the responsibility to administer the trust as a prudent person would in light of the purposes, terms, and other circumstances of the trust. So in this case, you're administering a trust that pays retiree benefits. And it's in that context that you are acting as a prudent fiduciary. That duty requires you to exercise reasonable care, skill, and caution. And it requires each of you to educate yourself on the core activities of the retirement system and specifically the matters over which you have both authority and responsibility. Something that may not necessarily occur to one immediately, but under trust law, if you as a trustee have a special skill or a special expertise, you're actually required by law to use that special skill or expertise in conjunction with exercising your roles on the Board of Investment. And that applies, you'll see as I note in this third bullet point, to the skills that are required of certain of you to be appointed to this board or to sit ex officio on this board. That said, those of you who do not come to the board with those particularized skills aren't required by law to defer to the special expertise of your co-fiduciaries. You all have equal authority and responsibilities in terms of the judgments that you exercise.
Before we go forward beyond fiduciary duty, could you talk about a little bit about with regards to ESG? There's been a lot of attacks and they're alleging that those of us who believe in ESG risk factors are in violation of a fiduciary duty. If you can address that really quick, appreciate it.
Certainly. I'm not sure that it's a quick discussion, Mr. Santos, but I am happy to sort of lay out basic principles. As with all risk factors that are pertinent to your decision making, where there are environmental, social, or governance related risk factors that reasonably play into your assessment of whether, say, a particular investment is prudent or not. In my judgment, it is absolutely reasonable for you to consider those risk factors, but it's in that context, and we will get to that. It's applicable to what I'm talking about today, because what you are to be doing is to ensure the competency of the assets of the retirement system to pay the promised benefits on time. That means you're investing with your eye on that ball. To the extent that the term I hear used is of sustainable investing, to the extent that because of the long-term duration of your plan, there are certain, say, environmental factors that are critical to consider, or perhaps there are governance lapses that you're attempting to address that play into or contribute to an assessment of risk-adjusted return, that's absolutely appropriate. But what I'd recommend is that each of you look to your specific managers and see how they are performing in that context, with your eye on risk-adjusted return, long-term duration, and performance on those various points. I hope that answers your question sufficiently.
Yes, thank you very much.
Welcome. All right, so a couple of years ago, a few years ago now, boy, time passes, the Court of Appeal in California went through pretty carefully some of the applicable fiduciary principles that apply to trustees of public retirement systems. And they quoted from the Restatement Thirds of Trust, which is not new, and that we had other case law in California that quoted from the restatements, but it is very current. And that case actually dealt with certain challenges to the way that the board handled actuarial assumption setting or actuarial decision making. So it's particularly pertinent here. And what the court noted as an initial guideline is that the trustee has a duty to administer the trust diligently and in good faith in accordance with the terms of the trust and applicable law. So what does that mean? That means when I cite to you provisions of SERL that relate to setting of contribution rates, determination of actuarial assumptions, that sort of thing, that is your guide. That is your trust. That's the law that applies to you. And so it's to be taken, it's to be followed. The skill that is required of you as you're engaging in this complicated task of setting actuarial assumptions, note is not is objective. It's not subjective to the trustee, which means that in the famous words of the Donovan versus Cunningham court, a pure heart and an empty head are insufficient. You can have the best motives in the world, but if you're acting in a way that is not based on what a court may later assess and determine as reasonable, they're not going to uphold it. And that happens from time to time. Second basic principle is that this prudence standard is not that of a layperson. You each come to the board with your own experiences and expertise, and it may well not ever have touched actuarial science or art or however it's appropriately characterized. More likely a combination of those two. But the law imposes on you this duty of acting as a prudent fiduciary with experience dealing with a similar enterprise. And I'm quoting from a case there in that second bullet point that talks about this. That's why it's so important to educate yourself, to have these sorts of trainings, and most importantly, to hear from your experts, your actuary, your internal staff who have expertise in these areas, and ask questions, but they really are providing a lot of important input for you to assess when you're making your decisions on these matters. And courts will probe the thoroughness of your analysis and the basis of your decisions rather than simply deferring. to a determination that you make. So the standard that applies in a court to this is were you arbitrary or capricious, and also whether your actions were founded on the evidence presented to you. So it's a pretty deferential standard, but courts will, from time to time, overturn board decisions on such matters if it thinks they have not engaged in the type of process or made the substantive decision making that that the laws require. How does that play out here? Now we're going to get into specifically the duty of care as it applies to actuarial services. The California Constitution speaks specifically in this subdivision E of Article 16, Section 17 to actuarial services. And it says what I previously summarized for you, which is that you have exclusive fiduciary responsibilities and sole and exclusive power to provide for actuarial services. Why is that? It's your power, but why do you have it? You have it to assure the competency of the assets of the retirement system. Why does that matter? Because you have the responsibility through LACERA to timely pay the correct amount of benefits to your members for their lives and for the lives of their beneficiaries. That is your key function. And that power is afforded to you. It's not afforded to anyone else. It's not afforded to your plan sponsor. It's not afforded to your constituents. It's your responsibility. In O'Neill, which is the case that I mentioned earlier that was filed against one of the other SERL systems, the petitioners were challenging various board decisions relating to actuarial methodologies and transfers of funds that the board had authorized there. And ultimately, after trial, the court concluded, the lower court and then the Court of Appeal concluded that the board had not violated its fiduciary duty of care to make certain actuarial decisions that resulted in lowering the employer's contribution rate. The challenge there was that the amortization schedule that the board had adopted exceeded 17 years, and so permitted some negative amortization, and that was challenged as imprudent and in violation of the duty of loyalty. And the court said, no, that was acceptable. But actually on this first round, this is a published decision that I'm quoting now or citing to now, the court was unable to determine on summary judgment whether or not the final decision that the board made on that topic was a breach of the duty of loyalty. And I'll discuss this later when I talk about duty of loyalty. Continuing with the duty of care, the duty of care includes not only a duty to make the reasonable, prudent decision at the outset, but you also have a continuing duty to monitor the decisions that you've made in the past. And that's consistent with your annual process of reviewing your actuarial evaluations, your typically triannual process of reviewing your actuarial assumptions and having an experience study to guide you in that process. And you are to take corrective action when reasonably appropriate. That's fundamental as sort of a general principle of law, but it's also built into the way you do your actuarial assumption setting through the periodic reviews that you engage in. Another aspect of the duty of care includes your obligation to consult with experts. I say obligation because there are certain contexts where it is necessary and appropriate in the making of informed judgments. And the quote that I have in the first bullet point here relates to investment specifically, but this applies to actuarial assumption setting as well. It requires, the duty of care actually does require securing and considering the advice of others, such as legal, actuarial, and investment, internal and external experts on a reasonable basis. As to the actuarial process, though, the SERL is even more specific. And I've quoted the government code provision here, or two government code provisions here actually, that state this, that when you are setting employer contributions, they are to be set upon the basis of investigation, valuation, and I've italicized here, recommendation of the actuary. It is absolutely fundamental and critical under SERL that you be acting within the recommendations that you're receiving from your actuary. The actuary hopefully will provide you with some reasonable options or considerations, maybe a range, maybe not a range, but it is very important that you assess whether your actuary is prepared to recommend actions that you're considering before you are adopting them in an actuarial context, because that again is built into the trust. As I said at the outset, you're to operate within the plan terms. The plan terms are SERL for this purpose, as well as PEPRA for other aspects of contribution setting as it applies particularly to the allocation of contributions between members and participating employers. But it's that recommendation of the actuary that is key, and I've cited that here. The implicit corollary of the duty to consult with experts is that if a fiduciary fails to follow the advice of your expert fiduciaries, either internal or external, and it's possible that they won't necessarily have same recommendations to you on a given matter, and so that in and of itself provides you with reasonable alternatives. If you don't do that, though, you need to demonstrate an informed, reasonable, and prudent rationale for doing so. And what I said on the second bullet point is, I think, particularly important, that your basis for taking an alternative course of action needs to be based on the expertise that's in question. So, for example, when you're talking about an actuarial assumption, you're to be consulting with actuaries. It is not for somebody who has another area of expertise, say your investment consultant even, to say, well, your actuarial assumption should be X, regardless of what your actuary says. And the reason is the actuary is certainly to take into account what your investment consultants say as to a particular topic which is within their expertise, but duration matters. And when your actuary is talking to you, they are talking to you about the longer term duration of your portfolio to pay the promised benefits, which I suspect your investment consultant and other staff experts on the investment side are sometimes looking at a somewhat shorter time frame. But that's an important question to ask when you're receiving that sort of advice. Once you've consulted with your experts, reliance on those opinions typically would be viewed as reasonable so long as, number one, your expert has appropriate qualifications. So it matters who's advising you. Your expert has accurate and full information. If information is not being withheld from them, purposefully or not. The expert lacks bias. Sometimes that's a way of challenging experts. The complexity of the topic and good governance may well support the delegation. And that goes to the point that I made earlier, that from a fiduciary standpoint, it's often the prudent step to either delegate or seek out that expert advice. And in the case of actuarial assumptions, it's actually required by SERL. And that under all the circumstances, reliance on the expert's opinion is reasonable. You as prudent fiduciaries should also question methods and assumptions that just don't make sense to you. And so that is where you get into the rigorous debate that can lead to even better decision-making, because you've engaged in that sort of discussion and debate before you take final actions. Prudence is the key to delegation on all aspects of topics. So the first question that arises, and this is a more general principle that applies to all your decision-making than simply actuarial assumptions. But the first question is whether to delegate. Second, how to delegate. Third, to whom you've delegated a particular action. And then the fourth is how to supervise. How does that apply as to what we're talking about today, which is actuarial assumptions? You will have determined those actuarial assumptions through the Board of Investments decision making. But then what you do with respect to staff is you delegate the implementation of that through the implementation of the contribution rates that you've determined. They will submit it to the Board of Supervisors. It's ministerial approval, but it does need to go to the Board of Supervisors for approval and for implementation of the rates and the collection of contributions. Summary on fiduciary duty of care. Prudence requires that you ask questions and that you understand the rationale of actions before taking them. It requires you to analyze advice and recommendations that you've received. But if you haven't if you're not adopting the experts' recommendations, you and again, I know that in the context of actuarial assumptions, it's particularly perilous if you are not receiving recommendations from your actuary and are nevertheless taking actions. Or are taking actions that are contrary to their recommendations is I'd say the most perilous. You need a reasonable basis to do so that's informed by the applicable expertise implicated by the decision and is consistent with your fiduciary duties of care and loyalty. Prudence also requires that you follow the plan document, here being SERL, which I've mentioned a couple of times, and other applicable law, as well as any regulations, policies, resolutions, or other rules governing LACERA that the board may have adopted over the years. Any questions on duty of care before I go to duty of loyalty? I don't see any. Okay, trust you will stop me if you have questions. The fiduciary duty of loyalty starts with the exclusive benefit rule. Your duty is to administer the trust solely in the interest of the beneficiaries and solely in furtherance of the trust's purpose. That goes a bit to Trustee Santos's question in terms of ESG. Make sure that what you're doing is looking out for the interest of your beneficiaries in furtherance of their retirement security. Except in discrete circumstances, the trustee is strictly prohibited from engaging in transactions that involve self-dealing or that otherwise involve or create a conflict between the trustee's fiduciary duties and personal interests. We'll talk about that a little further down, but just noting for sake of clarity on this point, when you're setting actuarial assumptions and you're determining contribution rates, for those of you who are active LACERA members, it obviously impacts you personally when the assumption changes result in an increase in active member contribution rates. As a matter of California law, that in and of itself is not considered a conflict of interest that would prohibit you from acting on the matter. It's not the thing that should be driving your decision making for sure, but it is, that is considered part of the public service generally provided to the members and beneficiaries of the plan that you provide. And even though you as an elected or an active member of the board, as you are required to be in your particular positions, do have arguably a financial interest under California law, it's not considered a disqualifying financial interest. It's actually considered a non-interest, both because it's governmental salary under the Political Reform Act and because it falls under an exception, a non-interest exception to 1090. Government Code Section 1090. I diverge a little bit, but that's a question that comes up a whole lot, so I thought it might be helpful to note it. The fiduciary duty of loyalty also specifically requires under the California Constitution prompt delivery of benefits and related services. I've come back to that theme a couple of times in this presentation, but it's set out in quotations here because it is explicitly stated in the Constitution that you are to administer the system in a manner that will assure prompt delivery of benefits and related services to the participants and their beneficiaries. The primary duty role is also a fundamental trust principle that is articulated in the California Constitution in the italicized portion of the language quoted on this slide 16. And that is that a retirement board's duty to the system's participants and their beneficiaries shall take precedence over any other duty. You'll note if you read all of the words on this slide that there are references to other duties. They talk about discharging your duties solely in the interest of and for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits to participants and their beneficiaries, comma, and then it says minimizing employer contributions thereto and defraying reasonable expenses of administering the system. That language, minimizing employer contributions, gets a lot of interest from time to time. My advice from a fiduciary perspective is that is not a fiduciary duty. Your fiduciary duty is to the members and beneficiaries. You do not have any fiduciary duties to your participating employers, nor do you have any fiduciary duties to the taxpayers. What you do have, though, is an obligation not to overcharge inappropriately your employers. And I think that's what this is getting to, that you minimize employer contributions by prudently investing the assets of the retirement system. Not putting the money under the mattress or investing only in a type of investment that anticipates a very low return. You are permitted to invest in accordance with sort of modern portfolio theory across the market and to maximize your risk-adjusted returns as much as you are prudently able to do so. That's a way of minimizing employer contributions. Another way of minimizing employer contributions is not to seek to overfund the system. Your target should be 100%. It shouldn't be 120 or 130%. Those are the principles that apply from a fiduciary perspective when looking at this language of minimizing employer contributions. The fiduciary duty of loyalty is, in the context of many trusts, including public retirement trusts, complex and cross-cutting. And I'll explain that point a little bit more in a second. The framework, though, in which to think about the duty of loyalty is to consider what's in the overall best interest of your members and beneficiaries. The balance may not be obvious when the interests of your members and beneficiaries are not the same. And that's most clearest here when you think about the different interests of, say, your retired and deferred population versus your active members. Your retired and deferred population aren't paying contributions anymore. What they care is about getting their retirement benefits in the right amount on time. It's far less important to them some of the consequences that your actuarial assumption setting may have on current contribution rates. Your active members may have a different sort of your active members who are PEPR members may have a different view of things than your classic or legacy members. Your safety members may have a different view of things than your general members. So there are all these sort of complex cross-cutting interests of those whom you serve. But that is similar to private trusts where you have income and principal beneficiaries. So people who are receiving income from a trust while it's in existence may care about one thing, whereas those who are only going to receive a principal distribution care about something else. Unfortunately, under California law, the law has evolved to grant you a fair measure of discretion to balance those competing interests, but it is important that you understand it, you think about it, and recognize it with your guide again being to ensure the competency of the assets to pay the promised retirement benefits to your members and to collect contributions needed to support those retirement benefits while people are employed. You all come from different places on the Board of Investments in the sense that some of you are appointed, some of you are there, one of you is there ex officio, Others are elected by a subgroup of members. But once you're on the board, you are all co-fiduciaries. You all have the same duty of loyalty to the members and beneficiaries. And what Prop 162 said, when it was before the California voters back in 1992, was that you are not to be meddled with. You are not to be interfered with in connection with doing your job on the retirement board. So it is not for the one who appointed you or for those who elected you to sort of twist your arm, if you will, with respect to your responsibilities on the board. You are to be independent and operate in that way when engaging in your responsibilities on the retirement, on the investment board. No less than the U.S. Supreme Court has affirmed this in the famous NLRB versus Amex case. That was an ERISA case. ERISA does not apply to governmental employers, but the trust principles that were discussed in that case as they apply to this concept are similarly applicable. And that is that nothing in the language of trust law reveals any intent that the trustee may or should administer the trust in the interest of the party that appointed him or her, or that the employer may direct or supervise the decisions of a trustee that that employer has appointed. So what about employer contributions? There have been some contexts where retirement boards, and in the case of LACERA, it would be a board of investment, whichever board has the responsibility and authority to set contribution rates, have been challenged on the theory that what they were doing was to benefit the employer rather than the members and beneficiaries. And Bant versus Board of Retirement is one of those cases that was against a different Searle system from the O'Neill case. O'Neill was another case on this topic. And what both of those decisions concluded was that in those particular instances, the retirement systems or the boards that were making the decisions were permitted, though not required, and that's very important, to take certain actions that resulted in reducing the employer's contributions, so long as, three really important bullet points here, the actions that were taken didn't compromise the competency of the assets of the retirement system assets to pay promised benefits. Very important as well, there was no conflict of interest in doing so. That was the subject of the infamous litigation against the one of the city retirement systems in California relating to this topic, and that the action is in the overall best interest of members and beneficiaries, as that interest relates to matters of proper concern to the retirement system. Here on the second bullet point, I've noted the topic that I got into a bit when we had the language in front of us of the California Constitution related to minimizing employer contributions, that is secondary to the primary duty, which is to timely pay benefits to members and beneficiaries, which is your fiduciary responsibility. O'Neill noted that, or it endorsed the conclusion in Bant that a retirement board could consider its active members' interest in retaining their jobs when making funding decisions, and that a trier of fact could view conduct preserving current jobs as good for current retirees who rely on continuing contributions to ensure the viability of the retirement. Cautionary note though, the court in O'Neill required a trial to be conducted to determine whether there was a breach of the duty of loyalty in that instance, because competing inferences could be drawn from the record regarding the purpose or the motive of the actions taken. So again, going back to the making sure that what you're articulating is that you are looking out for the best interest of your members and beneficiaries when you're taking decisions with respect to actuarial assumptions that may have a positive impact on the employer. What will be looked at, if that fiduciary perspective is what your motive was, as shown by the public record. The trial court issued a 57-page opinion in that case, analyzing the board's actuarial and related determinations that the plaintiffs had challenged and that had been subject to the trial. and concluded that the board did not breach its duty of loyalty in its decision-making because it sought to take actions that were prudent and in the overall best interest of the members at the time of an extreme financial risk to the retirement system and its plan sponsors. Note that the decisions that were challenged in that case came after the Great Recession. So this was decisions taken in the 2008-2009 time period that included transferring certain non-valuation reserves into valuation reserves and no longer having those funds in the non-valuation reserves available for ad hoc benefits. What the court concluded that I think is most important from that statement of decision is the statement that I put in blue indented here and quoted. Most importantly, in this court's opinion, the board's decisions help the county manage through the financial crisis in the short term to assure the sound funding of the promised benefits in the long term. That's important because once again, the court's going back to what's the responsibility of the board. It's to ensure the sound funding, often the term used in these cases, actuarial soundness, but here they say sound funding of the promised benefits in the long term. Court of Appeal affirmed that trial court decision in an unpublished opinion. Applying now these fiduciary principles to setting of actual assumptions, I've summarized the principles that we've been talking about through this presentation. First of all, the board's actuary leads the process for the board's discussion of a variety of things, reviewing your current pension fund asset allocation, which your investment consultant and your CIO will also have gone through with you, I'm sure many times. Reviewing your economic and demographic data from plan experience and other sources. We'll often talk with you about risk tolerance. That's when you're assessing risk-adjusted return from an investment perspective. You'll also talk about it in terms of these assumptions that the actuary will bring to you and other policy considerations. And all of these assessments are to be made with the goal of ensuring the competency of the retirement system assets to timely pay promised benefits. I hope that that language is sort of drilled into folks so that that is what you're thinking as you're and articulating as you're going through this process. The economic data will come from your plan experience and and other sources, and it will focus typically on your investment gains and losses, inflation and productivity, demographic changes, if any. You consider other data and modeling that your actuary will provide. Often there's stochastic modeling and other sorts of efforts that the actuary makes to show you impacts of how various assumptions will impact the funding of the retirement system. And then you act upon recommendations that the actuary provides to the Board of Investments. Based on all of that input, including the actuary's recommendations and discussions, you determine an appropriate long-term, and I say they're sort of rhetorically, how long, economic actual assumptions regarding your assumed rate of return, your real rate of return, price and wage inflation, and any other economic assumptions that are under review. And you engage in a similar process with respect to your demographic actuarial assumptions, such as mortality and that sort of thing. Engage in a prudent process as you go through this. So making sure that your decisions and decision-making process is well documented, that you have the materials in your packet that you're considering, that you discuss them, and that your decisions are based on actual recommendations, that you continue this monitoring process. So you adopt these assumptions on a recurring basis at appropriate intervals, which certainly is 3 years is by statute, at least 3 years, every 3 years. And sometimes they're looked at more frequently in connection with your annual valuations. And that they're designed to comply with your responsibility to act as prudent, experienced, and loyal trustees with respect to the administration of the plan. Specifically, and I know that I've seen actuaries refer to these rules, actual standard practice rules, that require that your assumptions be reasonable individually and collectively. It's such that they're reasonably calculated to require that the contributions from your employees, from your active members and your participating employers together will maintain the competency of the retirement assets to pay all of the promised benefits when they're due. That was a lot. Any questions? I will stop sharing my screen so that I can see you all better.
Not at this point. So we're moving forward. The next item on the agenda, subsection B. Mr. Kremen is not here, so Mr. Ranger.
Yes, good morning, Chair Santos. Thank you. And thank you, Ashley, for that information. So good morning, Chair Santos and Board of Investment Trustees. My name is Ted Granger. I'm with LACERA's Financial and Accounting Services Division. I'm here to introduce the speakers today, Nick Collier and Craig Glide, LACERA's consulting actuaries from Milliman. I would like to recognize and thank Noah for driving the slides today. And thank you, Noah. We have our roadmap slide up here first. So very quickly, I just have a couple of comments before I hand it over to Nick and Craig. June 30, 2022 is what we call a triennial year. This means that Milliman will perform an actuarial investigation of experience or experience study. The last time we completed this was for 2019. Today's presentation is part one of a three-part series. We'll walk through that here in a second. Milliman will discuss the economic assumptions today, as noted on the slide. They'll also talk about actuarial methods. We are looking for guidance and consensus from the trustees so we can move forward in the process. So we're looking for some input on the economic assumptions today. The roadmap, we obviously are in October. Moving forward to November, we'll discuss the demographic assumptions. And then in December, Milliman will prepare a draft experience study report. And so they will provide and confirm all the decisions that have been made by the board through these discussions. We'll move into March of next year where we will present the valuation report. And that allows us enough time to communicate the updated employer and employee contribution rates to the county so they can adopt them by the deadline. Just one other note, this is a process will be reviewed by Kavanaugh McDonald Consulting. That's our separate actuarial firm that conducts the review process. This is per the the board's retirement benefit funding policy. And this means that CABMAC will take a look at our process for developing the assumptions, and CABMAC will also review the valuation report results and compare them with their anticipated results and provide your board with their reports. So I'll give Noah a quick second to transition over to Milliman's slide deck, if he could please do that. And unless there's any questions for me on the timing and the timeline, I'm going to hand it over to Nick Collier from Milliman.
Thanks, Ted. Good morning, all. As Ted said, today we're going to discuss with the board our recommended economic assumptions and actual methods to be used in the valuation. So Ted has already laid out the schedule for you in the actual projects roadmap, but I did want to talk to you briefly about the actual process on the right side of the slide. The inputs to the valuation are the gray and green shapes. The gray shapes, the census data and the asset data are basically fixed from our perspective. So the real variables in the process are the assumptions and the methods, which we'll be discussing today, at least the economic and actuarial methods. Once the assumptions and methods have been set, the valuation is primarily number crunching. So the adoption of the assumptions is the board's primary input to how the valuation is performed. With that, I'll turn it over to Craig to discuss the economic assumptions.
Next slide, please.
Oh.
One more, please. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nick. So as Nick mentioned, this part of the presentation is to discuss the economic assumptions that will be used in 2022 actuarial valuation. And just before we start talking about those in detail, I'd like to start with an overview of the specific assumptions that we will be covering today. So first of all, there is the inflation assumption. Now, inflation affects the valuation directly and indirectly in a couple of ways. National price inflation, or CPIU, is directly used in projecting the PEPRA compensation limit, and otherwise is indirectly used as a component of the investment return assumption. Local price inflation is reflected indirectly in the different assumptions for salary increases, payroll growth, and retiree COLAs. Generally, in the past, we've used a single assumption for inflation, but when we look at it, we do consider both the national and the local price inflation when we're reviewing that and making recommendations about inflation. So next up is the retiree COLAs. Now, each of the legacy, sorry, if you go back, please. Thank you. Each of the legacy and PEPRA plans have a cap on the amount of the annual COLA, and it's set at either 2% or 3%, depending on the plan. The assumption that we currently use and in the valuation for COLAs is generally equal to the local price inflation expectations, but taking into account the plan specific caps. And when we look at that, we also consider the COLA banks that have been accumulated and what impact they will have on future retiree COLAs. Moving on to the general wage growth and the payroll growth. Thank you. We make assumptions for both general wage growth and payroll growth in the valuation. The distinction between them can sometimes be a bit confusing, but the general wage growth assumption is generally used to project the salaries of existing employees and therefore affects the future benefit amounts. And it includes components to reflect expected local price inflation and real wage growth in excess of inflation, if there is any. Payroll wage growth relates to the overall growth of LACERA's payroll and is used primarily in the calculation of setting the amortization amounts on the unfunded liability. They're generally quite consistent when we assume a stable population. However, those two assumptions can diverge a bit if we were in an environment where the population, the active employee population, was growing or shrinking. And in that case, they could separate. But generally, we've had those be very consistent over time. And finally, on this page, the investment return assumption, which last but not least, it is typically the most significant assumption used in the valuation. And it's used to discount the future benefit payment streams to calculate a present value or a liability of LACERA, and is very prominent in the determination of future employer and member contributions. Next slide, please. So this chart just shows graphically many of the things I was just discussing there. The main takeaway here is that the 4 bars we're looking at, these are really the direct assumptions that are used in the valuation. Each of those is made up of more than one component and is influenced by some of the indirect assumptions that I was discussing, specifically inflation. So you can see here that the investment return assumption includes components both for national price inflation and a real rate of return. The individual salary increases include 3 components for local price inflation, any real wage growth, and also a component for merit increases. That's the yellow bar on the top. And that yellow bar is actually a demographic assumption, so it's not going to be considered today, but the general wage growth piece is the local price inflation plus the real wage. And currently that's what's being used for both wage and payroll. And then on the retiree COLA side, it's the local price inflation with a consideration of the COLA banks. Next slide, please. So when we review the assumptions, our goal is generally to recommend assumptions that are appropriate for the mid to long term. One of the challenges this time around is that the current economic environment has been quite volatile. And so we're trying to understand what impact that is going to have on long-term trends. We discussed many of these trends and potential headwinds when we presented our risk assessment report at the June board meeting. But as you know, over the last year or so, we've seen many changes in the economic and macro environment. Some of those are specifically that inflation has spiked in 2021 and 2022. It's currently running at around 8% year over year and 6% year to date. This is affecting wage expectations, and there's challenges with hiring and retaining employees. Interest rates have rebounded from multi-year lows, and the 10-year treasuries and AA corporate bond yields have each increased about 200 basis points this year to date. The S&P 500 PE ratio has declined significantly from its highs, and it's currently more in line with long-term averages. And that's happened as the index has declined about 25% from its peak over the last year. And so a lot of these short-term fluctuations are contrary to what some of the long-term trends have been in these items. And so we're considering those and have to consider whether and how much of a lasting impact we think those are going to have on long-term trends and expectations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're looking at both long-term trends and short-term fluctuations when we make our forecasts of what are reasonable assumptions for the mid to long term. And when we do that, we attempt to not place too much emphasis on the short-term fluctuations in case they are just short-term fluctuations and not representative of long-term trends. With that said, and as a spoiler to some of my upcoming slides, you can see here in this middle column that we are actually recommending no changes to the current economic assumptions. This is partially driven by the current uncertainties and how different recent experience has been relative to long-term economic trends, primarily those long-term trends towards lower investment return assumptions and lower inflation that are very different than the current trends we've been seeing. But I'll explain more about these on the next slides. Next slide, please. So first of all, looking at price inflation, and I mentioned earlier that inflation is generally an indirect assumption in the valuation. The current assumption is for 2.75% annual inflation. And although current inflation, both on a national level and a local level, is much higher than this 2.75%, most long-term inflation forecasts are for inflation to actually be less than 2.75%. Over 10 and 20 years. So for example, Milliman and Makita's 20-year capital market assumption forecasts are expecting average annual inflation of about 2.2 to 2.3%. And the Horizon survey of 40 investment advisors and the Social Security Administration are each forecasting about 2.4% long-term inflation. LACERA's current assumption of the 2.75 is a little bit higher than the median of 2.5% for the 100 largest retirement systems. However, up until very recently, over the last 50 years, local inflation had run a bit higher than national inflation in the Los Angeles County area. And so while the short-term expectation is for higher inflation, the long-term trend is actually for lower inflation than the 2.75%. And since local inflation also tends to trend a bit higher than national inflation, we're going to recommend no change at the current time to the 2.75% assumption for the 2022 valuation. We'll also be recommending no change to the current retiree COLA assumption. However, because of the current COLA banks and the cap on the amount of retiree COLAs, even if we did make a change of, say, 25 basis points to the inflation assumption, the effective retiree COLA assumption would still remain unchanged. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that when we look at general wage growth, we're looking at individual members' increases, and that their annual salary increases are made up of three components. And those are local inflation, real wage growth, and an individual merit component, and that's one of the demographic assumptions. So the general wage growth is those two first components there, the local inflation and the real wage growth. those two components are generally not mutually exclusive, but estimates of the national average real wage growth over the last 50 years or so has been about 0.6%. And our estimate of LACERA's specific average real wage growth has been about 0.5% over the last 30 years or so. The Social Security Administration actually projects long-term average real wage growth at about 1.2%, so significantly higher than what some of these historical trends have been. And so that's definitely a factor also. The current general wage growth assumption is 3.25%, which is a combination of a 2.75% price inflation assumption and a 0.5% real wage growth assumption. And while we think there may be certainly some short-term deviations from this assumption, we believe that at the current time, this is still an appropriate assumption to be used over the long term, and it reflects both national and local inflation and the real wage growth expectations. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that the payroll growth assumption is used primarily in the calculation of the unfunded liability amortization amounts. And this is because that amortization method is designed to be a level percentage of payroll over the 20-year amortization period. And so to keep it as a level percentage of payroll, we have to make an assumption for the projection of payroll. Generally, as I mentioned, when we have a stable population, the payroll wage growth is very consistent with the general wage growth. But if the overall population was growing or shrinking, we could see some deviation there. Until recently, LACERA's active population has been very stable. So the assumption has been set equal to the general wage growth at 3.25%. In the last couple of years, LACERA's active employee population has shrunk a little bit. But we expect that over the long term, that is likely to stabilize more again back to some sort of some steady state similar to what it's been historically. So while in the short term we think there could be some variance there as well, we do think that because of that projected stability over the longer term, that keeping that payroll growth assumption at 3.25% at the current time is also appropriate. Next slide, please. So moving on to discussing the investment return assumption. As you know, over the first 6 months or so of this year, there's been some significant changes in the financial markets and in the economic expectations. And so we have a couple of slides just to show the difference between what the capital market assumptions look like at the beginning of the year versus at June 30th. So this slide is looking at the beginning of the year assumptions. And so you can see here in the box on the top right of the screen that for both Makita and Milliman at the start of the year, the expected investment return forecasts were quite similar over both 10-year and 20-year periods. Makita was at 5.6 over 10 years and Milliman at 5.8% average annual return. And over 20 years, both were at 6.6%. The Horizon survey was a bit higher, but in all cases here over 10 and 20-year periods, the expectations for future investment return was 7% or lower. And as a reminder, 7% is the current investment return assumption used by LACERA. These expectations were also consistent with a gradual trend that we've seen over many years towards lower investment return assumptions, lower expectations of future investment returns overall. Next slide, please. So now we look forward, we're currently looking back, but we look ahead from the beginning of the year to June 30th and how capital market assumptions changed based on that first 6 months of 2022 experience. And many investment consultants don't issue mid-year updates, but this year Makita and Milliman both issued updates to their capital market assumptions at mid-year because of the changes. And when they did, Makita's 10-year expected investment return had increased 170 basis points to 7.3%, and Milliman's had increased 110 basis points to 6.9%, reflecting that experience of the first 6 months. On the 20-year basis, Makita's expectation had increased by 120 basis points to 7.8% average annual return, and Milliman's had increased by 70 basis points to 7.3%. And Horizon did not issue any new mid-year assumptions. So after these increases, both Makita and Milliman's 10-year forecasts of future investment returns are reasonably close to the current assumption of 7%. And each of their 20-year forecasts are about 40 or 50 basis points higher than their 10-year forecasts. With Makita's, like I said, at 7.8% and Milliman at 7.3%. Next slide, please. So although we've seen these short-term increases in the investment return expectations this year, the long-term trend among large public retirement plans, including LACERA, has been towards lower investment return assumptions. So since 2000, or back in 2000, LACERA was using an 8% average annual investment return assumption, and over that 20 or so years, that has steadily stepped down towards to its current level of 7%. This is very consistent with LACERA's peer group. Currently in 2022, about 70% of large public retirement systems have an investment return assumption of 7% or lower, compared to almost none just as recently as 2008. And so based on these forecasts and long-term trends and some of the current uncertainty about short-term trends and whether they will persist and have an impact on long-term trends, we think retaining the 7% assumption is prudent at the current time, and allows for a little bit of potential reversion in expected returns, which may or may not happen. But if there was to be some reversion, then the investment consultants may end up lowering their future expectations again at that point. So we think retaining the 7% is prudent, and may also help to retain some stability in the employer and contribution rates over the coming years. Next slide, please. And I will hand it back to Nick to talk about some actuarial methods.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Noah, for moving that forward. So in this chart here, we kind of get in some of the real nuances of how the calculation is done with the actual methods. And we show here the current actual methods, as well as some alternatives. There's 3 circled alternatives that represent our recommended changes. Looking at the first line there, the current normal cost method, the entry age cost method, should result in level normal costs in theory, if there are no assumption changes. That's why it's used by the majority of the public sector retirement systems, and we recommend no change there. The current actual asset method smooths investment gains and losses over 5 years to reduce the volatility in the employer contribution rates. And this is the most common smoothing method used by other public sector systems, both the smoothing and using 5 years. We recommend continued use of the 5-year smoothing method with one modification, which I'll discuss in a little more detail shortly. We had an extensive discussion about the method to amortize the unfunded liability 3 years ago. And the board adopted the 20-year layered approach. We believe this is still a reasonable approach and recommend no change to that. We do have once again, this is a nuance, one adjustment that we're recommending for consistency with actual guidance. This would only affect LACERA in cases where there are benefit increases that are outside of the current plan provisions. So if you went back to early 2000s when there was the big changes in benefits, that type of thing would be reflected over a shorter period. I did want to apologize. This chart did not get updated correctly, and that circled line says that circled area says none suggested. It should have said one recommendation, and our recommendation that these type of increases that occur in the outside of the plan provisions that result in increase in the unfunded liability be recognized over a shorter period, being 10 years, and that change would be consistent, as I said, with actual guidance. As we discussed in the past, on the next line, there are two ways to reflect administrative expenses. We haven't spent a lot of time on this, but did just want to mention this. So there's the implicit method currently used by LACERA, where administrative expenses are assumed to come out of investment earnings and then are considered as part of the investment. And these expenses are considered as part of the setting of the investment return assumption. The second is the explicit method, where the administrative expenses are paid as part of the normal cost rate. Either method is reasonable, and they're used about equally among county systems. We are recommending continuing with the implicit method, as we believe it remains appropriate. Last extra method is the treatment of the STAR reserve. Obviously, there's been a bit of time spent on this in the past, and apologize, but we are going to rehash this. So to remind you, currently the STAR reserve is included as a valuation asset, but the value of future STAR benefits that would come from the STAR reserve are not included in the valuation. LACERA has an established pattern of granting STAR COLA benefits with payments coming from the STAR reserve. So we recommend the STAR reserve be set aside in the valuation for future STAR payments by excluding it from the valuation assets.
I welcome that. I welcome that very much, by the way.
Thank you. So moving to the next slide. As I said, we're recommending adjustment on the asset method, and this is probably going to be a lot of explanation for a very small adjustment. But since this would be a change and something we haven't talked about in the past, we wanted to provide some additional description. Based on analysis we've done, this modification, which we'll refer to as the offsetting method. So we still have the 5-year smoothing, but we'd say with offsetting. It's expected to reduce the volatility of future employer contribution rates, and is also expected to reduce the likelihood and magnitude of spikes in employer contribution rates, where the rate is expected to increase 1 year and then decrease the next year. But this change isn't expected to negatively impact either the projected funded ratio or the contribution rate level. So we kind of believe this kind of approach is kind of a win-win. And this is a simplified example. We show how mechanically it would work. Note these numbers are rough approximations of the actual returns for the last 2 years. So they're fairly similar to what actually happened. So under the current method, we have already recognized 1/5 of the $10 billion gain for the fiscal year ending in 2021. So that leaves $8 billion. So that $8 billion is recognized in $2 billion chunks each of the remaining 4 years of the period. Now, for the most recent fiscal year ended, we had a loss, and we just kind of approximate that about a $5 billion loss. So then we're going to be recognizing that $1 billion loss over the next 5 years. So how that works out is for 4 years, you have a $2 billion gain with a $1 billion loss. So that translates into a $1 billion gain that's recognized over the next 4 years. Then in the 5th year, then you have this $1 billion loss, and you can see that is represented by the blue bars. And as we'll show later, that translates to 4 years of contribution rate decreases, but then that follows with an increase. So not as smooth as it could be. So under the offsetting approach, we take the current year $5 billion loss and offset it against any remaining gains. And remember, we had $8 billion left after recognizing the first $2 billion. Then we have this $5 billion loss. We offset that against the $8 billion gain, and that leaves a $3 billion gain, which we then recognize over the remaining 4-year period, represented by the green bars there. So this results in 4 years of gain recognition, but not that ugly loss that comes in the 5th year. So this kind of approach, as we'll show, results in smoother employer contribution rates. So we can see that on the next slide. So as I said, a lot of numbers there. I think it can be best seen with as much as a real life example as actuaries can ever come up with, which is what we've done here is we've projected the employer contribution rate going forward, but assuming LACERA's returns for the last 25 years would occur over the next 25 years and repeat. Once again, the blue line represents the current method and the green line shows the results if we added offsetting to the 5-year smoothing. The first thing you're going to see is the patterns are really pretty similar, as we'd expect, because the returns are really going to be the driver of what the contribution rate is. However, as you can really see probably clearest in the middle of the graph in the year 2023 and the years surrounding that, the current method has a noticeably higher increase than the offsetting method. Similarly, in 2028, surrounding that, you see a dip, and the dip is greater under the current method, which also means that increase that goes up to the spike in 2023 is a much greater increase. So hopefully what you can see here is that pattern provides a smoother pattern of contribution rate changes. And of course, we're actuaries, we like to kind of mathematically quantify that. And you can see the average, if you look at the average change from year to year, under the current method, the average change is 1.93% of pay. Under the alternative method, including the offsetting, it's only 1.67% of pay. So not a huge difference, but we believe having a smoother rates and having less year-to-year changes is probably preferable from the employer's perspective. And as I said, we've done a lot of modeling on this, and there's no negative impact on either, as far as lower funding ratio or higher contribution rates, just basically a smoother pattern. So moving to the next slide. So, and then one after, thank you. So first of all, just, obviously where we're at right now, to put perspective of where we expect to be next year with the changes we've discussed. So you see the current rate is about 24.5%, represented by the blue bar on the left, which comes out to about a 2.27 billion employer contribution. And then rolling it forward to the next year, and obviously this is just an estimate because there are other things that we don't have reflected. For example, there may be some changes in the demographic assumptions that could affect it, and we don't have the valuation completed, so that will also have an impact. But we have reflected some of the key things that we know about. Obviously, the return for last year, although relative to other systems was very positive, was still significantly less than our 7% return assumption. So that results in an increase. Now, fortunately, we had, as we said, that gain coming forward. So that would kind of offset that. And you see, after we shuffle all these things in here, which include the modification of the asset smoothing, if that's adopted, the actual return, the actual payroll, and the actual inflation, as Craig talked about, was high. So that tended to increase the liabilities more than we expected. We actually end up almost at the exact same spot, or we're estimating at 24.4% by the second blue bar there. Or about 2.33 billion contribution on an annual basis. And then you see for, as I should mention, we're talking about the fiscal year beginning July 2023, which would be the rates calculated in the upcoming evaluation. And you see, as we've talked about in the past, if the STAR reserve was excluded, it's about a 0.5% of pay increase. So we have that at about 24.9% if the STAR reserve was excluded from the assets. So moving on to the next slide. And I think this really shows, one way that asset, the modification of asset smoothing impacts things. Well, first of all, we show the financial impact. We're showing a small increase due to adopting the offsetting method. This could just as easily have been a decrease. It really just depends on the timing of the investment gains and losses, and what the short-term financial impact. Just because you had a gain followed by a loss, it ends up being a small decrease. But we could this easily could be flipped and looked exact opposite if you went from a loss to a gain. And as I said, that's really the flip side there. But you can see right here, obviously, that that although you get some nice decreases in the employer rate, then it spikes up, as we talked about, when that last gain rolls off and all we're reflecting is the loss. Then we see an increase. And obviously, this is assuming future years are 7.5%. That prior slide, we talked about the employer contribution rate with the actual LACERA returns for the past 25 years. So you can see the smoothing there. So anyway, that's the financial impact on the asset smoothing modification. I note we have not shown separate slides for member contribution rates or for the 10-year smoothing. So I did want to talk to you about that. So first of all, on the member contribution rates, based on the recommendations, there will be no changes to the member rates because we're not changing the investment return assumption or the general wage growth. Except year to year, and we have a triennial, we usually have a true up, and so that can have a small impact on the member contribution rates. Also, we'll be looking at the demographic assumptions, in particular the mortality and the salary increase can impact the member contribution rates, but obviously not changing the investment return assumption keeps the member contribution rates more stable. The second piece was the 10-year amortization of benefit increases. Obviously, as I talked about, the big example of that would be the increases that we had when the benefits were improved back in 2001, 2002. At this point, we're not projecting anything like that. So we're not really expecting the 10-year, this 10-year really to come into play. I mean, the one place that it potentially could be is that, as you know, I think, a permanent star COLA was recently adopted by the Board of Retirement, effective for 2023. So that would be reflected in the 2023 valuation. Under the current star reserve treatment, that would result in an increase in the unfunded liability in the valuation, because, as we said, we're not reflecting future star payments, but we are including the star reserve. So when the additional value of the star payments would flow through. And so that would be, under the current method, we would treat that as a 10-year amortization, but that number is actually quite small in the grand LACERA perspective. So whether you did it over 20 years or 10 years, the impact would still be less than 0.01% of pay. So it really wouldn't even be noticeable whether you're using 10 or 20. As I said, it'd only be if there's a big change that you would see a difference in using this approach. And I just note that if the star reserve is excluded from valuation in the future, then the increase in star benefits would already be accounted for, and there would be no impact on the unfunded liability. So moving forward, and I think the favorite words from an actuary in conclusion. Craig talked about the economic assumptions recommendations. Obviously, a lot going on there, and we think it's prudent to keep the return assumption at 7%. And also on the other economic assumptions, once again, there's some forecasts of slightly lower inflation, but seems a little counterintuitive when you have very high inflation to be lowering that at this time. So we recommend keeping inflation and the general wage growth the same. As I talk about, we're recommending excluding the star reserve from valuation assets. And then the two other modifications to the smoothing method, and then the shorter recognition of changes in plan provisions that increase benefits. So that concludes our presentation, and we're happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you very much. We'll have Mr. Knox and then Mr. Kehoe. Mr. Knox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. The recommendations seem very reasonable to me. Just a quick question back on slide 13, where it was mentioned that 70% of the large systems now have a assumed return of 7% or less. Just curious if the majority of those are at 7, or the majority of that 70% below 70? Just a little extra context if you have it.
Yeah, if you go to the end of the presentation, it's going to be almost the last slide. Sorry, Noah, it's kind of moves kind of slow. I think the answer is going to be it's about half of that 70% that is at 7%, and then about a half that is less. Oh, sorry, if you can go, there's like supplemental exhibits.
I see slide 37 has the distribution.
Yeah, 37. Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, that was helpful. Thank you for the information.
And yeah, this confirms, yeah, it's about, so you can see, yeah, it's about 30, it's about half at 7 and about half below 7.
Great, thank you very much, Mr. Kehoe.
Thank you. So my question surrounds inflation. So we're assuming a 2.75% inflation in this. Obviously, we know inflation's been much higher. We don't know what the impact will be in the long term. But if we looked back at the 1970s with a longer term high inflationary environment, what impact does that have if we miss the target here? So if inflation does continue to remain high, what impact would that have if we miss the target? How do we correct that in the future? And I just want to make sure that we're that there's no unintended consequences by not touching the inflation aspect.
Do you want to take that one, Craig?
Yeah. So if inflation remained high, the biggest impacts that it could have, it's mostly going to be the indirect impacts. It would be higher salary increases that would cause benefits to increase faster than would be assumed by the assumption. So we would see some actual losses coming through each year because projected benefits would be higher than what we expected them to be. On the retiree side, it wouldn't have a huge impact because of the caps on the retiree COLA benefits. That is 2% for most retirees, but 3% for Plan A. So even inflation above that they would be capped at those levels. There'd potentially be higher STAR benefits awards would come through, and that would be paid out of the STAR reserve. So those are there'd be some other indirect impacts, I'm sure, on the actual investment experience that would happen as the investment markets adjusted to the inflation. But the biggest impacts on the valuation, I think specifically would be on those salary increases and retiree COLAs.
Yeah, and the one good thing from LACERA's perspective, the salary increases, Craig, that if you have significantly higher salary increases, that's going to result in significantly higher benefits. But the kind of offsetting impact is LACERA collects on payroll. So if the contribution rate is 20%, you're getting 20% of the higher payroll, so you're going to get higher contributions coming in to help offset those increased benefits.
Got it. And since that wasn't necessarily reflected in the most recent raises applied to the county, that would be a catch-up scenario in 3 years. So in 3 years, we'd be able to see, okay, the county is looking at doing larger raises to offset the inflationary period that we're in, and then we have the ability at that point to do some adjustments. So, okay, that answers my question. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Trustee Kehoe, just to follow on your thought a bit. So what you're referring to would be the experience study in 2025, and you're correct. I would also point out that Milliman does perform the annual valuations, and they are required by actuarial standards to look at the assumptions that are in place for each annual valuation. If things are starting to get sort of out of whack or out of alignment, Milliman will come back to us, the board, and LACERA staff, and say, okay, we think there might need to be an adjustment. We might need the board to take a look at this particular assumption. It's just gotten way out of alignment. So just wanted to point that out on an annual basis. Milliman does review the assumptions as well.
Thank you, Ted.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Any other questions? If not, I will entertain a motion.
I'll move.
No, I'll second it.
Okay, it's been moved and second. So
Point of order, Ted, are you asking for action today?
We are not asking for action today. I believe this is a report item on the agenda. However, we would like to obtain a consensus from the board. It sounds like we're okay with moving forward with this, these economic assumptions that Milliman presented, and we will then put these in a draft report for the board to consider in December as part of the experience study draft report package. And we'll.
And can I do this as a receive and file then, and then we'll.
Yeah, well, I will appreciate that, Mr. Kehoe. But before we do that, any colleague objects or to any of the recommendations by the expert? I see none. Mr. Kehoe.
So I'll change my motion to receive and file.
I will second that. Thank you very much. That concludes the presentation. The rest of the reports are for the information only. Any colleague would like to discuss any of those reports? Seeing none, I neglected the CIO report and the CEO report, so we're going to go back to that, Mr. Grable. CIO report.
Good morning, Chair Santos. This is Louis. I'm stepping in for Mr. Kryman. We just have a couple of items to highlight from the CEO report, mainly the safety member election. We're looking to have this certified by the Board of Supervisors, hopefully by October 18th, at which point Mr. Jason E. Green will commence his 3-year term effective with January 2023 for both the Board of Investments as well as the Board of Retirement. Also, as was the case with our joint meeting a few weeks ago, staff is preparing the boardrooms for a hybrid meeting to start in November. Bonnie and Linda will be taking a survey to see which board members will be on site as opposed to those that will be remote. So please look out for that email here shortly as we prepare kind of our readiness for the board meetings here in November. And then lastly, just a recruitment update. We continue to progress, as highlighted in our report, on some of our recruitment engagements, specifically the senior investment officer recruitment, as well as the FA3 for real estate recruitment progresses. And I think by the end of this month, we should have some traction in terms of selected candidates. Also, I just want to highlight that you'll see on our website, we have several human resource positions that we've posted, which we're looking at expanding our capacity and will help with some of the vacancy backlogs. So we're pretty excited about those vacancies. So if you have any HR professionals that are in the market for a job, please steer them our way. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Great, thank you. The only addition to your report, unless I missed it, is that Mr. Kehoe will remain on the Board of Retirement as an alternate member. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. Mr. Jones.
Yes. So just a question for you. The on the communications plan, is there a viewable version of that draft that we could see? I know it's probably still pretty raw or whatever else, but this has been an item of longtime interest of mine since I came onto the board. So I'm just curious to see what some of the inputs into it look like at this stage.
Absolutely, Trustee Jones. Thank you for that comment. It is still in draft form. We have an internal and an external communication plan that we're working with EKA. We're looking at alignment with our strategic planning efforts, but we can certainly look to share kind of the rough draft. It's really something that we have to work on in terms of some of the elements of those communication plans, both internally with our communications team as well as externally with EKA, our public relations consultant. But we can I'll talk offline and maybe look to see if we can share some of that.
All right, thank you, Lugo. I appreciate it.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Grable. CIO report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was kind of hoping I'd get the pass and be able to use my comments next month, but I guess I'm not so lucky. And in some sense, you know, it's easy to share good news. It's probably more important to share tougher news. And thank you, Noah. If you could turn to slide 4. I'll do a truncated version. Slide 4 shows the performance of global markets through the end of September, our first fiscal quarter for fiscal year 23. The valuation in here of the performance of the portfolio is as of the end of August, please bear in mind. If you look at the upper left, MSCI ACWI index, that's the global equity market, that is our benchmark, and it shows year to date through September down 25.7%. If you look in the bottom right, Barclays US Aggregate Bond Index, that's our benchmark for fixed income. Year to date, that's down 14.6%. And these numbers are calendar year to date. So if you think about a reference portfolio, the 60-40 portfolio, if the two inputs are down 25.7 and 14.6, 60-40 equates to down 23.3%. And so it really is important for us to keep that in mind, and it really dovetails with the recommendation for Milliman to keep 7% static, notwithstanding the kind of assumption that there's some form of mean reversion, and to frame, that 60-40 is down, and it's hard to generate returns when the two major building blocks are down so much. Once again, it's easy to be exuberant in up markets, bearish, or pessimistic in bear markets. And that's why we, LACERA, avoid market timing. We are not driven by behavioral biases that may push us to do the wrong things at precisely the wrong time. And going back to my typical sound bites, that's why I'll reiterate our focus on strategic asset allocation, our investment beliefs, and our long-term program. And one other slide, if we can go to slide 9. This is returns through August. The fund was down 1.9% in August. The market value AUM was 71.2 billion, cash at a sufficient level. And on the right side, asset allocation is all within target. And on the next slide, this shows the performance of the fund and OPEB against our benchmarks over the 10-year time horizon. I'll point out that for the September period, it's likely that the fund will have a negative read that will be down for 2 consecutive quarters. I think that we've had some good experience against the benchmark, but we will be down for 2 consecutive quarters. And then OPEB is more prone to swings and has a higher market beta, just because the portfolio currently is all public markets, and that will change as we implement the private market exposure. So I'll pause there, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, thank you very much, Mr. Grable. I don't see any questions. So we're moving forward. Items for staff review.
I don't have anything, Mr. Santos.
Thank you. Any items for future agenda?
Not yet.
No. Go to the order. Let's do roll call.
Okay. Ms. Ginsburg?
Nothing for the group, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Green?
Just a huge thank you for the meeting today. Really appreciate it. And more importantly, go Dodgers. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kehoe?
very unique meeting today. We covered a lot of different things, so I appreciate everybody's effort on today's meeting.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
Great job, staff, again, with the preparation for today's meeting. Appreciate that. And then being a native Atlantan, but current Southern California, Los Angelino, go Dodgers and Braves.
Thank you. Miss Greenwood?
Well, I'm going to parrot the trustee who also has green in his name. I want to thank staff for putting together an outstanding meeting, actually pair of meetings, and go blue.
Thank you. Mr. Grable?
Nothing, thank you.
Stephen Rice?
Yes, thank you. Just briefly, we did offer MCLE credit for Ashley Dunning's presentation, and I'm required actually by the MCLE rules to advise those trustees and staff at the time of the meeting who want to receive credit that I'll be sending an email out to you to provide electronic confirmation to Ashley's firm of your attendance and certain information that I'll put in the email to you. There'll also be an evaluation form which she's required to make available and which she would appreciate you returning. So with that, thank you very much. Nothing else.
Thank you. Louis Lugo?
Just briefly, I want to and thank you, Chair Santos, for acknowledging Trustee Kehoe. Certainly want to congratulate him as well in terms of his continued engagement with both boards. So thank you.
And Chair Santos?
Yes, thank you. Kind of want to follow up on Mr. Jones's comment and go to the order of the Corporate Governance Committee. Like you, Mr. Jones, I'm highly offended. This brought back memories for me that I didn't really want to remember. There's a lot of racism in Latin America, especially for people that look like me, short, dark, and ugly, as this woman was calling me. I also happen to be of native descent and an Inca. Half of my family came from Europe, and the other half are from the Incas, indigenous in South America. So growing up, there was always a big issue. If somebody called you a stupid Indian, it was fighting words. You would not use that unless you really meant. It's kind of similar to using the N-word. So that's when I read that, I was so offended and brought back memories when I was a kid where bullies in school would call me a stupid Indian just because of the way I look. So it's just very offensive, and unfortunately, I know the majority of those individuals who were in that meeting, and it's shameful. So on behalf of the Latino community, I'd like to apologize to the African American community, to the Jewish people who were also mentioned, and any other group that was mentioned in a derogatory manner. The Armenians, I mean, they were just about almost everybody. So as a Latino immigrant, I apologize for my stupid people. We all have those kinds everywhere. Unfortunately, these people are in leadership, and I'm glad SCIU and many other leaders in our community come out demanding that they resign. So thank you. I appreciate that. With that, I believe anybody else would like to say anything else? See none. At this point, we're going to go back into executive session. We have 2 items. So let's take a 2-minute break. And so, Linda, what time we reconvene?
So 11:44.
11:44. Thank you.